I do not know whether Napoleon did or did not try to get across there, and I don't care. I don't know much about history, and I wouldn't give a nickel for all the history in the world. It means nothing to me. History is more or less bunk. It's tradition. We don't want tradition. We want to live in the present, and the only history that is worth a tinker's damn is the history we make today. Today, with none of the irony lost on me, I want to tell you about the life of the man who brought the automobile to the average American. Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863 in Dearborn, Michigan, the oldest of 5. His father was an English immigrant who settled down in a modest farmhouse, marrying the daughter of a Dutch farmer. Ford's early life was spent learning to hate not all work, but inefficient work. In one of the books he authored during his late life, he tells an anecdote about how a farmer will carry a bucket up a ladder a dozen times rather than install a pulley system with a rope. Considering the advances in farming technology that happened during his lifetime, it shouldn't be surprising that he felt this way. Young Henry was educated in a one-room schoolhouse from the age of 7. His teacher, Mr. Chapman, taught 1st through 8th grade in that one room simultaneously. Among the things he learned were grammar, math, geography, and ethics. The thing that contributed to his future success from childhood, however, came in the form of a 13th birthday present from his father, his first watch. He was fascinated by the internal workings of it. After dissecting his own, Ford would borrow watches from anyone he could find and ask to take them apart and put them back together. This, combined with school visits to a local blacksmith shop, inspired him to start collecting tools and making a workshop for himself, and eventually a forge on his parents' 40-acre farm. He would spend hours tinkering and working on various projects, which included at one time trying to put a small engine on a tricycle. It was in the workshop, at the blacksmith's, at barn raisings, and at a local sawmill where the young boy was allowed to pursue his passion for all things mechanical. In 1880, when Ford was 17 years old, he went, against his father's wishes, to live 9 miles down the road in the fast-growing city of Detroit. The city of Detroit, like many cities of this time, was seeing huge amounts of population and industrial growth. Tons of people were going there to build their lives up in America's second industrial revolution, and a city with a thriving steel and copper industry that was strategically located where it could serve as a transportation hub linking the East and the Midwest was a logical place to do it. Given the amount of starry-eyed farm boys moving to the city, it's no surprise that Ford found himself working 2 jobs just to pay rent. On his first day in town, he picked up a job at a machine shop called James Flour & Company, working on steam engines, among other things. When he discovers this isn't enough, he gets a night job at a jeweler's shop repairing watches and clocks. Altogether, his income is $4.50 per week. He was just another face in a sea of cheap laborers in the city. But if anything made him stand out, it was how much he loved the work he was doing. In 1882, after 4 years of city life, his father back at the farm offered Ford 40 acres of land to live on, but there's a catch. The condition stipulated by his father was that he had to give up machining and turn to farming. So naturally, at the age of 21, Henry Ford took the land, set up a sawmill motor, built a house and then a machine shop, and then started fiddling with engines. His father was mildly concerned, vocally expressing more faith in Henry's 2 brothers. Nevertheless, Henry started farming when he wasn't working on motors, and made his living like that for a good few years. It was around this time that Ford started courting a girl who would later become his wife, Clara Bryant. A neighbor would recall seeing him drive her around during the winter in a steam-powered sleigh which he built himself. Amazing. When Ford was 24 years old, these two would get married, marking the start of a long and prosperous life together. During these years, the thing Ford was trying to complete in his machine shop was a practical design for a tractor, or maybe a road vehicle, that ran on a motor. Since his experience at Flour & Company was in steam-powered motors, he was stuck on that idea for a while. The problem he faced with steam was that there was always a trade-off between power and weight. By the time you got a big enough motor that it could put forth a lot of energy, it would take that much more energy for the motor just to move itself. Even the small ones, when he tried them, would frequently overheat, which wasn't good for anybody. Eventually, after enough failed motors, Ford realized that he needed to move on from steam and try something he hadn't worked on before. Something that was very, very new to the world. A multi-cylinder, gasoline-powered motor. He would begin work on this, unaware that a small handful of other people from the United States and Europe were also working on primitive designs for gas-powered vehicles around the same time as him. After building a very tiny gas-powered engine in his workshop on the farm, he realized that, to continue, he would need things he couldn't get on the farm. That's why, at the age of 27, he moved back to Detroit. This time, rather than working for scraps, he found a better-paying job at Detroit Electric Company for $45 a month. He set up his workshop in the backyard shed of his new home, and, every day after a 10-hour workday, he would go there and work on his brainchild, which would be a transportation device on 4 wheels run by a gas-powered engine. To fully appreciate what Ford was working on, I want you to think about what's under the hood of a car. Think about what it would take not only to build an engine from scratch, but to do it in a time where most of the relevant parts haven't yet been dreamed up. Imagine trying to rig up something to work as spark plugs only using things that you found in a scrapyard. Yeah, that's what Ford was doing here. And we know that he was pretty dedicated to it too, because in 1890, a neighbor took him to court over a noise complaint, stating that he kept hearing hammering and some kind of weird sputtering long after dark. It would take 6 more years after that court case before his Frankenstein-esque metal creation was ready. It was well after midnight in April 1896. It was raining. Henry Ford starts up the monster and then pushes it out of the shed. It was a 2-cylinder, 4-horsepower motor on a frame with 4 bicycle wheels, and it shook like a beast. It was noisy enough to wake the whole neighborhood. The gas tank had a 3-gallon capacity, the seat held 2 people, and the controls consisted of a steering wheel and a clutch that had 2 speeds and no ability to reverse. Ford carefully mounted the operator's seat and shifted it into gear. The thing jumped to life. He drove it to the end of the street and then brought it home under its own power. This would be one of the defining moments of Ford's life, a night when everything he had been working towards came to fruition. Before this, he was considered the lunatic of the block. After news of this accomplishment spread, he would be one of the most famous people in Detroit. Now, it was time to figure out what to do with it. Ford kept working at the electric company for a while, even getting to meet Thomas Edison, who would become one of his lifelong friends. Ford would later recall, after telling Edison what he was working on, that Edison encouraged him to keep going because he saw potential in it. Ford, encouraged, sold the first automobile to Mr. Charles Ainsley of Detroit for $200, and built 2 more of his own cars before 1899. What happened next was that companies competed to get Ford's interest, the first one offering him a $10,000 advance to design cars for them, to which offer Ford resigned his previous job and gladly accepted. During these few years, Ford hopped around sponsors, including one that would become the Cadillac Car Company in the future, creating different car designs. His cars would keep winning races and breaking speed records, generally generating more name recognition for Ford himself than for the companies that represented him. The most notable of Ford's competition cars was named the 999 and came in half a mile ahead of his competitors during a race, shortly before Ford started his own company. Spoiler alert, Ford starts his own company. There was still one thing that disappointed him, though. The automobile was not yet useful to the common man. It was, instead, a luxury toy that only the richest Americans could afford to buy. It wasn't until 1903, after a few failed attempts, that Ford successfully opened his own business, backed by a longtime friend, a coal salesman named Alexander Malcolmson. Together, they would hold 51% of the company stock. 10 other investors would hold the other 49%. The next step for them, after gathering enough investors, took them to a deal with the Dodge brothers, who owned a factory that could produce the frames for the cars they wanted. As the deal stood, the Dodges would use their machine shop to build a total of 650 car chassis, that is, the complete car without the body and wheels, and deliver them to Ford for $250 apiece, a total of $162,500. Altogether, the cost per car was projected to be $604, and the selling price was set to be $850. The miracle in this was that they found people willing to invest that much into Ford's idea. Granted, the idea was pretty good for its time, considering the Dodges took stock in Ford's company and turned down offers from 2 other companies because they were so impressed by Ford's design. But that much money in this time for a brand new company is a stretch, even if they did have a huge name behind them. It shouldn't be understated the uncertainty that all these people felt. Many of the investors had taken out loans to invest in the company. If anything went wrong, they were ruined. It took the combination of Ford, Malcolmson, a successful businessman, and the Dodge brothers to fully convince all of them. By summer of 1903, the first Model A Ford cars were on the road. The price had been raised by $50 from the predicted price, and reports from customers had started coming in that the 1,100-pound Model A car was having trouble climbing hills. In response, Malcolmson hired and sent out Ford Company mechanics to respond to customers who complained, and Henry got to work trying to figure out a solution to the problem. More trouble came, this time in the legal form, when a company which held the patent to the motor car and forced other companies to pay royalties to it, the Electric Vehicle Company, took Ford to court for patent infringement. The court case, which would go on for 8 years, from 1903 to 1911, would eventually be settled in Ford's favor, specifically stating that the patent was taken out only for vehicles with a certain motor design. The motor design in Ford cars was not this certain type. This case would be a huge success for the auto industry as a whole. If you know anything about American politics at the time, you might recall that trust-busting Teddy Roosevelt was elected in a landslide in 1904, and then in 1908. Taft, a man of similar political disposition, was also elected in a landslide. Given the sentiment at the time, you might be able to guess how the public viewed a mechanic entrepreneur underdog winning a patent suit against a corrupt monopoly working to choke out all competition in the new industry. News of this court case made Ford into a hero. In 1905, as cars evolved, we see Ford design two new models: the Model B, which features a 4-cylinder engine, and the Model C, which features a 2-cylinder engine but 4 seats and side doors, a new addition. Over the next few years, Ford would experiment with more designs, working his way up the alphabet as his company grew in value. By 1907, Ford himself owned 58.5% of the company because he would buy stock up whenever investors sold it. Because Ford owned such a large portion of the company, shareholder satisfaction wasn't something he needed to worry about when he made his decision to purchase a 60-acre plot of land known as the Highland Park Racetrack, with plans to build the largest automobile factory the world had yet seen. His dream was to simplify the production process and do something that was as of yet unheard of: mass produce. In his own words, "I will build a motor car for the great multitude. It will be large enough for the family, but small enough for the individual to run and care for. It will be constructed of the best materials by the best men to be hired, after the simplest designs that modern engineering can devise. But it will be so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one and enjoy with his family the blessing of hours of pleasure in God's great open spaces." That car was designed in 1907, and the letter it fell on in the alphabet was T. In 1908, the factory was under construction, and Ford's yearly car production was just over 6,000, compared to some other companies' 8,500. People thought he was crazy. A car as anything but a toy for the rich was thought to be a fantasy. His industry competitors, who had formed an organization which had long since been paying royalties to the electric vehicle company, the same one Ford was challenging in court, smeared his cars in their advertisements. They pointed to the ugliness, the cheapness, and especially Ford's royalties situation, saying, "Don't buy a lawsuit with your car." Their smear ad couldn't keep him down, though. The Model T had come to affectionately be known as Tin Lizzie. It was advertised as being tough and dependable, perfect for the life of an American farmer. It was consistently cheaper and more reliable than competition, and was advertised to be so simple to repair that even a farm boy could do it between milking cows. It was tailored perfectly to the do-it-yourself attitude of rural Americans. Some people even say that a car one could so easily fiddle under the hood with contributed to the stereotype of Yankee ingenuity, that is, the perception that Americans are good at rigging up a mechanical solution to almost any problem. An attitude I'm proud of. The plant being built on the 60-acre property bought by Ford in 1907 was open for production on January 1st, 1910, and that year the Ford company built nearly 20,000 cars. It was at the Highland Park assembly plant that, over the next 5 years, the famous assembly line technique was gradually developed and perfected. The logic behind the assembly line was that rather than having the car in progress sit in one spot making the workers move around, they could have the workers stay in one spot, be supplied by a continuous flow of needed parts, and make each car move down the line, each worker adding 1 or 2 parts to it. One of the great benefits of this process was that most of the workers didn't need to have any specialized experience. Working arms was enough. If you were to spend a whole day assembling a car from pre-ordered parts, you would need to know a lot about how cars work. If you were to spend a day tightening lug nuts on dozens of cars, all you would need is a wrench. The rest is easy. Because of this, Ford could afford to hire a multitude of low-paid, unskilled workers in his factories rather than expensive specialists. Critics of Ford attacked the monotony of the work, stating that he was subjecting his employees to slow torture. Despite the fact that it was more often outsiders than employees complaining about it, Ford, in January 1914, in a highly publicized move that broke the glass ceiling for Ford's fame, he announced that all of his factories would be putting in a minimum wage of $5 a day. That was more than double what it was previously. If you'll remember Ford's early years in Michigan, all of his workers would now be making more money than he did at that time. With the price of the Model T continually getting lower as the assembly line kept improving, $600 in 1913, his goal of even his lowest paid workers at his factory being able to dream of owning a car was getting more realistic. When he made this move, the news exploded with it. He was the center of attention for the entire nation, and everyone had an opinion about it. Most big-name business people denounced the move for whatever reason, calling him a socialist and saying his business would go bankrupt because it couldn't afford the minimum wage. A meeting of leaders of the Socialist Party announced that they, too, disagreed with the move, stating that it purchased the hearts, brains, and souls of his men. Nevertheless, newspaper slander was met with thousands of fan mail letters to Ford's office and people swarming the factory to look for jobs. Everyday people loved his philosophy of mass production. He would never again live life as anything less than a celebrity. World War I started in 1914. The famous Christmas truce occurred that year. Although it would be years until Americans joined the fight, Ford had long since taken notice of the situation. He had spent the better part of a year denouncing the war and promoting peace before, in December 1915, as President Wilson denied a plan for continuous mediation, Ford adopted the very unrealistic slogan, "Out of the trenches by Christmas." His plan was to sail a ship, the Oscar II, from New York to Europe, filled with Ford as well as several peace activists and American politicians, an attempt to get leaders of the fighting nations to sit down and talk about peace. The idea was that all participating nations were tired of trench warfare, and given an opportunity presented by a neutral party, would gladly attempt negotiations. The newspapers laughed, not only at how unrealistic the Christmas goal was, but how hastily thrown together the peace ship idea seemed to be in practice. Ford would become sick on the journey and return home early, but he would keep funding the expedition for the others, over $400,000 by the time it finished. If you paid attention in world history class, you can guess how well that went. Despite being a Republican, Michigan's favorite son was passionate about re-electing President Wilson in 1916. The president even visited Ford's Highland Park plant and was greeted by a huge banner reading, "He kept us out of war." Ford would go as far as paying for newspaper ads in favor of Wilson's campaign. Some of these, which heavily criticized pro-military programs, earned Ford over $1 million worth of libel lawsuits. 1916 was a big year for Ford and his company. His son, Edsel, got married in November. Ford sold a contract to the British government to make for them not cars but tractors, which were urgently needed because of a food shortage on the island. The Ford Company, because it was making over $1 million a week, announced a particularly large price drop for the Model T following a string of gradual increase in affordability. This time, the price was lowered by $80 and brought down to $360. This after the average income of his factory workers more than doubled in the course of a few years. His shareholders, of course, enjoyed their millions of dollars, so they weren't too thrilled. The Dodge brothers among them took out their frustrations with Ford's profit sacrifices in court when they tried stopping him from building a second huge factory in a place called Rouge River. They were successful in lower court, but Ford appealed to the Supreme Court of Michigan and got the ruling reversed in his favor. In 1916, the Ford Company was producing 2,500 Model Ts every day. It had over 30,000 employees, and it was starting to develop a stricter social policy for them. Among the Ford employees were a copious amount of immigrants. The company offered language classes as well as coaching for the citizenship application process for them. Another charitable effort on Ford's part was the Henry Ford Trade School, opened in October of that year. Its purpose was to teach both trade skills and high school curriculum to underprivileged young men. Of 12,000 applicants for the second year of operation, 2,800 were admitted. Among the less charitable of the company's policies were some guidelines for how employees should be spending their relatively large paychecks. They were encouraged to improve their quality of life rather than wasting money on temporary pleasures. They were encouraged to improve their homes and families and to buy life insurance rather than drinking and gambling. It should be noted that alcoholism in this time was over-stigmatized and commonly linked with spousal abuse. This was seen as a huge social issue, huge enough that America made an amendment to its constitution banning its consumption. In extreme cases of employees disobeying this policy, people were fired. The company would later back off its strict enforcement of this, but still, it was something that happened. America would enter the war in 1917 after provocations from the Germans. Ford, along with the rest of the nation, would shift his opinion on war from peace without victory to peace through victory. He would use his factories to mass-produce military vehicles and equipment for the government during the short year that the nation was fighting in Europe. In 1918, the ever-outspoken Henry Ford would throw his hat in the political ring. Although he considered himself to have been born Republican, he would run instead as a Democrat. This because he was persuaded by President Wilson to run for U.S. Senate in Michigan, against a Republican who was opposed to the League of Nations. Ford would run a strong campaign, and then lose, and then proceed to sue his opponent for libel and accuse him of election fraud. A born politician. Speaking of Ford being outspoken, here comes the big one. In 1919, he started publishing under a local newspaper he had bought called the Dearborn Independent, which would release regular weekly publications under Ford's direction, explaining some rather controversial ideas that Ford had been thinking over since he sailed the peace ship. The papers focused on the control of big banks by what Ford believed to be a secret society of Jewish bankers. Ford also expanded on this to claim that the same Jews who controlled the banks also had a large influence on American media and culture. In these publications, he assigned blame to them for many things including alcoholism, jazz music, and provocative dress, things Ford saw as threats to the traditional American way of life. This journal would continue being published for years, get banned and cause riots in Pittsburgh, and would go on to get over 900,000 regular readers. When the newspaper started getting banned in places as a result of negative press that Ford attributed to Jew-controlled media, he resorted to distributing it through his car dealerships. He even published a 4-volume book collection, PDFs of which can be found floating around online, and gave them to anyone who bought one of his cars. He would sell copies of this paper so cheaply that he lost millions of dollars running the production. He did this because he wanted to get the word out about the secret influence. The newspaper publications would continue until 1922. In 1926, Ford got a defamation lawsuit against him for these statements. He then made a public apology for the whole ordeal. While this was a big singular event, its legacy lived on for decades, haunting Ford's future professional life, as well as influencing the minds of people calling for racial purity. As it happens, translations of this paper were reprinted all around the world in multiple languages, including in the Weimar Republic in the German language. As soon as Ford found out about this being after the discontinuation of the newspaper printing, he asked them to please stop printing his work without his permission, or at least stop putting his name on it. But he got no reply, and the printing continued. It would be widely read, especially by a notable politician who published a book in 1925 called Mein Kampf. Yes, Ford was mentioned by name in Hitler's Mein Kampf because of his newspaper. Not only that, at the Nuremberg trials, Nazi officers have mentioned reading Ford's work as the thing that woke them up to Jewish control of money and politics. Ford and his paper's influence on the German public was indirectly responsible to the rise of the people who brought about the Holocaust. Illuminati confirmed. Many of the credible historians I've found tend to dance around this topic, and with good reason. They want to preserve their reputations. Actually, the most interesting and in-depth critical analysis of The Independent I could find came from an openly anti-Semitic website. Obviously, I don't condone hate based solely on religion, but I do want to take a professional risk by exploring a little bit of the mindset behind this, if for no other reason than I find it problematic how little this is talked about. I had no clue that Ford believed these things before starting research on this, and I think more people should learn that he did this. It's important to understand the mindset behind hate, wherever it manifests itself in history, and to understand that the people who hate are not something different from us, from normal humans. They're just people who, for whatever reason, see sense and logic in the arguments presented. Understanding the humanity of this will help us be able to see sense when situations like this arise. I'll start off my analysis with a quote from his book. "The Jew is the world's enigma. Poor in his masses, he yet controls the world's finances. Scattered abroad without country or government, he yet presents a unity of race continuity which no other people has achieved. Living under legal disabilities in almost every land, he has become the power behind many a throne." Although some of his more German readers didn't follow suit in this, Ford did draw the distinction between the unaware, everyday people who happened to be Jewish, and the corrupt Jews who held power and pulled strings behind closed doors. I believe that Ford was stupid in this regard for not more clearly spelling this out, that his mind was more fit for engineering and production, not for the social sciences. He should have kept his day job. More so, he could have done with rethinking his approach to the entire situation and simply calling out the corruption and elitist control that he saw for what it was, rather than linking it to a religion. Tangents aside, Ford is actually on record as believing that the unaware people would join him in condemning the corrupt, once they knew the truth about what was going on. He was proven wrong on this point by many newspapers branding Ford a racist. Throughout Ford's entire career, the legacy of this paper would be in the background, being mentioned by people who would use any excuse to attack Ford's character or company because they disagreed with his labor policies. These attacks against Ford and accusations of Nazism and extremist anti-Semitism, many of which were grasping at straws, surprising given the evidence available, came to a climax in the late 30s and early 40s, just before Pearl Harbor, when America entered the war against Hitler and Ford had his factories go all out in producing military equipment to help the U.S. win the war. To give an example of one of the straw-grasping attacks, on Ford's 75th birthday in 1938, he accepted honorary awards from several foreign countries in recognition of his contributions to industrial production worldwide. It just so happened that one of these happened to be from Adolf Hitler in Germany. The newspapers threw a fit over this, saying it linked Ford to Nazi ideas. I see this as an example of how hysteria on the part of the news broadcasters breeds incompetence and willingness to discard available credible evidence in favor of ridiculous, brain-numbing partisan pandering, a problem that I still see today. In terms of the legacy that Ford left behind after his death with regards to his writings on Jews, I see two schools of thought. One, that Ford had given up his anti-Semitic beliefs after the halting of the publication, and one that he secretly held on to them, even holding some beliefs more hateful than what was published in the paper. What surprised me is that credible historians tend to hold the former belief, and followers of hateful ideologies tend to hold the latter belief, not the other way around. The credible historians, perhaps better referred to as hero-worshipping biographers, a fitting insult that they're quick to hurl at each other while being guilty of it themselves, are quick to avoid the topic and spend as little time as possible discussing it, and when they do, they stick to the logistics of how the paper was published and other people's reactions to it, and make a footnote of the actual contents. Speculation on their part of Ford's opinion on the same topic in his later years tends to be non-existent. The anti-Semites of today, I shudder to cite them as a relevant source of information on this, despite the fact that they offer more intellectual thought than people qualified to write books on the topic, tend to apply false optimism in projecting some of their own prejudiced views onto Ford's mind. They claim that Ford never stopped believing in the need to do something about Jews, even long after he had shut his mouth about it publicly as the result of a lawsuit. I see this as a problematic claim, considering I don't see evidence of him hating Jews as a whole, ever. Only the corrupt elites whom he believed all conspired together against Gentiles. Furthermore, I do see evidence of Ford softening his stance on this later in life, such as this quote from an interview with him regarding the Second World War. "There's need for the Jew in the world, and it's bound to be recognized. Among the Jews are some of our ablest financiers and greatest merchants. They understand trade. They know that all prosperity is based on the ability of the farmer to buy, and they know the value and function of competition. They recognize it as the one thing that will keep business from getting slovenly." After the public controversy regarding this journal, Ford had bodyguards protecting his family. Despite dips into various interests on the side, Ford wouldn't neglect looking after his company. In 1918, he pulled a sneaky trick whereby he resigned the presidency of his company and left his son Edsel in charge. He would spend the next few months leaking rumors to the press that he planned to start another company with yet another car design. Only his reputation as being eccentric may have allowed this to work. After the resulting Ford stock plunge, Henry would send private agents out to buy stock from the original shareholders, something for which he had to take out a $75 million loan, because the Ford company name still carried a lot of weight despite the man himself being out of the picture. Once he had the stock, he resumed his role as president, now in significant debt to the bank which he loaned from. In 1919, company minimum wage was raised to $6 a day, which, in my opinion, was probably a bit frivolous considering what would happen to the company in the next few years. In 1920, Ford's next big idea was to artificially lower the prices of products in the American market. The goal was to get the economy back to the way it was before America's short year in the war drove up the cost of nearly every domestic product. He did this, at least for his own employees, by filling his company commissary stores with cheap groceries and other things, undercutting outside stores by as much as 40% and putting social pressure on them to lower their own prices. It was around this time that the company would attempt to completely own and control all levels of production, from raw material to finished product. They bought coal fields in Kentucky and West Virginia, they bought a sawmill, an iron mine, a huge furnace, and they even spent upwards of $8 million to buy and repair a railroad for the company's private use. Now that the pesky shareholders were out of the way, Ford also happily continued building the new Rouge River plant. Each of these purchases lowered the cost of production and thus enabled lowering of cost on the final product. Further cost-cutting precision was practiced by attempting to standardize exactly how much of each material needed to get moved from place to place each day, so that the factory never had too much or too little of anything. In 1922, the Ford company would employ over 50,000 people and would be able to produce a few thousand cars each day. And produce is just what they did. Remember that $75 million loan Ford took out to buy up all the company stock? Well, that was about to come due in the beginning of 1921. Ford's plan to pay for it was a huge surge in production of Model Ts, which he forced car dealers to take, or else take the Ford name off their dealership. Many of the dealers had to take out loans of their own in order to pay for the new rush of unexpected cars. Essentially, Ford traded personal responsibility for one huge bank loan, and split responsibility among many small dealers, each having their own small bank loan. Luckily, the cars would sell wonderfully, and most of the dealers were able to pay back their loans without any permanent loss. Over the next few years, Ford would take up a number of personal interests. First among these would be a brief political campaign in the 1924 Republican presidential primary. After a meeting with his opponent, Calvin Coolidge, he would resign candidacy and pledge his support. Another project of his was harnessing hydroelectricity. In 1921, Ford began construction on both a parts factory and a hydroelectric plant on Green Island, New York. The factory produced parts for decades, and the power plant, now under a new owner, is still producing clean electricity. Air travel was also experimented with. In 1924 and 25, he worked on building an airport and hotel in Detroit which featured regular flights to and from Chicago and Cleveland for paying customers. After his first year of service, the airline proudly announced it had no interruptions of flights in 1925. Around this time, Ford and Stout, Ford's partner in building the airport, took out a patent on a new aircraft guidance system. In 1924, Ford and his wife, now in their 60s, took up the hobby of dancing, mainly square dancing. They were known to have built a ballroom in the Ford Company office, hired a personal dance instructor who they kept on the payroll for 20 years, and kept a full orchestra on call day and night in case they got the urge to practice. In addition to this, they would regularly host and invite company executives to formal ballroom events. Relationship goals. Back to the company. Ford executives faced a new problem in the mid-20s. The Model T design was becoming obsolete. Its sales reflected this. Ford's closest competitor, still to this day, General Motors, sold 600,000 cars in 1924 to Ford's 1,700,000. 1924 was the year that Ford produced its 10 millionth car, and by 1926, GM was catching up. The Model T's design was 18 years old, and still clung to many outdated features while avoiding the new ones. While the attraction of the car was the most simplified, cheapest vehicle one could buy, other vehicles were starting to become cheap enough to make the market competitive. In 1926, it was to the point where someone could buy an 18-year-old Buick for the same price as a new Model T, and get a more luxurious car from it. This is where Henry's weakness was when it came to the car business. It was the same thing that made him successful in the first place. He wanted to make the simplest, most cost-efficient thing he could. For a good while, even after it became obvious the old design was floundering, Ford resisted designing a new car. In 1927, the company tried several aesthetic changes, including offering colors other than black. But after that year, the Model T was discontinued. One writer would describe the Ford's attitudes as if they were parting with an old friend. All in all, at that point, Ford made and sold over 15 million cars. Production halted for a short while Ford came up with a new design. As the story goes, they started producing a 4-cylinder Model A car. But after the first few thousand of the year came off the production line, Ford and his son together had a change of heart and decided to once again stop production and move to an 8-cylinder engine design. A quote from Edsel Ford: "My father is never happier than when he is solving some big mechanical problem. When the new Model A was brought out, he left many things to others, but I have never seen him give such attention to detail as he is doing now. He works for hours at a time trying to eliminate a single part. He figures that the fewer parts in a car, the less risk of trouble. In the Model A, this was carried so far that repair bills were cut in two." The stock market crashed in 1929. In response, Ford raised the daily salaries once again to $7 a day, in hopes that optimism would spark optimism and the economy would get better. That wouldn't be the case. It was in 1931, the same year production stopped once again at the Ford plant due to a change in the model, that the Ford company realized $7 a day was too high a salary to maintain and returned it to $6, still on the expensive end of unskilled labor prices, although layoffs were occurring due to the halt in production. Due to these conditions, a communist group in Detroit took special notice of the Ford company. Now, it wasn't like there weren't other companies at the time with more unfair practices. In fact, apart from being famous for not allowing their employees to unionize, Ford workers notoriously had some of the best benefits in any of the preceding decades. Some sources I've read theorize that it was Ford's reputation for treating its employees so well that made them a perceived easy target for forcing them to provide economic relief to a community whose unemployment rate was estimated between 30 and 50%. My own theory is just that enough people with enough personal vendettas against Ford happened to be at the right place at the right time in positions of social influence in these communist groups. I see the modern equivalent as something like a doxing post on Tumblr getting a ton of attention. So, like that, the stage was set. So, as you can imagine, there was a protest. The communist students would organize the logistics, and they would be joined by a large group of union members and former employees of the Ford company, of which about 50,000 existed, most of whom were terminated due to suspected union activity, as well as just people out of a job. They had talked to the city of Detroit ahead of time and made sure they had a demonstration permit for that day. The plan was to meet up in Detroit, then march with signs and banners all the way to the neighboring town of Dearborn, where Ford's Rouge River factory was. They dubbed it the Hunger March. Their demands for Ford were as follows: jobs for all laid-off workers, immediate payment of 50% of full wages, 7-hour day without reduction in pay, Slowing down of the deadly speed-up, this referred to the idea that the production line was being worked at maximum speed, at hazard to the workers. This is widely considered to be a false myth due to the delicate timing required for all levels of production in multiple locations to function smoothly. 2 15-minute rest periods per day. No discrimination against Negroes. I was interested in this point, so I looked up more info on it. While Ford willingly hired blacks, it could be fairly argued that promotion opportunity was unequal. Free medical aid in the Ford Hospital for both employed and unemployed workers and their families. 5 tons of coke or coal for the winter. Abolition of factory guards. Ford assumes responsibility for all mortgages of homes of Ford workers, no foreclosures. Immediate payment of $50 for winter relief. Full wages for part-time workers. Abolition of the graft system in hiring workers. The right to unionize. On this point, Ford was famously against unions and did not allow them in his factory. All of this next part is important because the event is something not a lot of people today know about, and I have not read any 2 sources that agree on all the details of what went down during this march. All my sources considered, I'll do my best. The march happened on Monday, March 7th, 1932. They met in Detroit, as was mentioned. All sources agree that it started with the demonstration leaders giving a speech and telling people to keep it non-violent, no starting any fights. The entire time they were in Detroit, things went well. Nothing really notable happened until they got to the city limits and found a team of about 35 policemen waiting for them. You see, they had a demonstration permit for inside the city limits of Detroit, but not for Dearborn. And when Harry Bennett, head of Ford security at the Rouge River plant, found this out, he allegedly called in a favor from the Dearborn Police Department. The police told the crowd plainly that if they crossed the city limits, they would use tear gas to break them up. The leaders talked it over for 30 seconds and decided they would keep marching. Some people went home, but a lot of them stayed. I don't know exactly how many, but it was in the range of a couple thousand. They marched on, and as promised, the police deployed tear gas. That is the most likely version for this part of the story. Sources with huge anti-Ford bias will say that the police fired tear gas without warning, unprovoked. Either way, the tear gas is the single moment where it stops being peaceful and starts being a mob. The wind did not favor the police on this day, and the tear gas had little effect. In return, the marchers started picking up rocks and bricks from the ground and throwing them. Onward they marched, despite batons and anything else the police could do against them. Next up, 2 fire trucks join the scene. They attempt to attach fire hoses to water hydrants, so they can use the water as a crowd dispersal tool. Pro-Ford sources say that they successfully did this, you'll see why later, and most other sources agree they were bombarded by rocks and had to leave before they could get the water flowing. It wasn't long before they got to the gates of the Ford plant. This is where everything gets really iffy. Most sources agree that Ford-owned fired hoses were set up spraying water down from above the gate to disperse the crowd. This would get them a ton of bad PR, and the company would officially deny it, attempting to shift all responsibility to the police and the fire department. The next part is even weirder, so I'll start with the most certain facts. Harry Bennett took his car out of the factory, and the car was bombarded with rocks. Bennett was hit in the head pretty hard and knocked unconscious, and he would spend some time in the Henry Ford Hospital recovering. Now, why was Bennett there, and what was he doing? Well, that's the big mystery of this whole event. Crazy biased anti-Ford sources will say that he started shooting a handgun into the crowd from inside his car, and that he was the only one in the car. Other sources say that he intended to try and negotiate with the crowd and the march leaders. How he planned to do that after fire hoses were going off, I don't know. The most moderate source I could find says that after Bennett got knocked out cold, the 2 Ford Company guards who he had in the car with him panicked and started shooting their own guns at the crowd. The Ford Company would insist that no Ford guard did anything to any protester. It was all the police. Either way, shooting started, police joined in the shooting, which I don't entirely blame them for since 25 of them ended up in the hospital. I do, however, blame the police for the tear gas. That was a stupid move. The guns broke up the crowd pretty quick. When all was said and done, 4 of the ringleaders for the mob were dead and 28 people were sent to the hospital for gunshot wounds. All in all, this was a massive mess. As the story goes, Henry Ford would call Bennett every day in the hospital, and when he got out, Ford gave him a fancy new Lincoln car to replace the one that got pelted by stones and bricks. This event blew up the entire news cycle and made Ford look pretty bad. It wasn't like labor protests weren't happening all the time in this area, but this was one of the few where actual guns were fired, and people actually died. The funeral for the 4 that didn't make it was attended by over 10,000 people. many of them openly wearing red armbands and other communist symbols to make a statement against Ford. There was a court case that resulted from this, which, if I may say so, was a bit unfair to the protesters. First off, there was a law in the area at the time that the police, in situations like this, were not held responsible for dead protesters, but protesters would be held responsible for any dead police. Thankfully, no police died. Second, the thing they were investigating for was secret collusions with Russians to undermine American society. I'm not kidding, the court was actually investigating and looking for a red conspiracy, and offices of several far-left groups were raided because of suspected connection. Some people in the hospital were even handcuffed to their beds. The court, after playing with the ridiculous story for a sufficient time, decided there would be no indictments. Despite this quip from the protesters, Ford actually did as much as anyone short of FDR when it came to relieving the Depression. Although he hated the term philanthropist and didn't want to be called by it, he was one of the great philanthropists, but he did it in a way that allowed him to rationalize his own actions as not being charitable. A quote from the Simmons book, cited below, that might better explain what I mean. His own reaction against charity was the humiliation it caused the recipient. He felt that charity was not humane, and he put his own helpful operations on the basis of goodwill and mutual trust. One of the big things he did was bail out banks. While we would call it bailing out, Ford would say that he simply left his money in the accounts at those banks, a kind of long-term loan as a sign of trust in the institution. The long-term loan, by chance, being exactly the thing that the institution needed to stay afloat. The banks he did this for, however, were not national by scale. He left millions in the Ford Company Bank, and he also did the same with dozens of smaller, local banks in towns where his employees lived. These actions had a great effect, although the benefit was limited to the towns which these banks served. Bailing out banks wasn't all he did either. Here's a primary source quote from a Mr. Easius Lee describing how Ford helped the predominantly black community of Inkster, Michigan. Unemployment had consumed the livelihood of this community, and as we faced the long dreary winter of 1931 and 32, human suffering and misery were inevitable. It was at this time that Mr. Ford came to our rescue in no uncertain manner. He opened the commissary on the IOU plan, hospitalized the sick, established a tennis court, clinic, tailor shop, dressmaking shop, bakery, and shoe repair shop. He liquidated homes, buying the contracts. He graded our streets and plowed our gardens, and built a 10-room school, which you see here. Greatest of all, he gave us a chance to work, which we most earnestly desired. The quote mentions Ford commissary stores working on an IOU plan. Well, I think that part is pretty important as well. Company stores operated giving credit to employees of Ford. This is important because this trusting of everyday people who were hard hit by the Depression to pay back new debts was a pretty strong example of the operations on the basis of goodwill and mutual trust that Simons talks about. Here's an anecdote from Chris Sinsabow, I hope I got that name right, about one time when Mr. Ford was driving through town on a rainy day. He saw a line of people on the street in the rain. He asked them what they were doing, and they told him waiting on jobs at the employment office. Mr. Ford told them that they were all hired on the spot, all 1,500 of them. Another story goes that he met a young, cross-eyed girl at a dance class one day. After talking to her family and finding out that they couldn't afford health care for her, he offered the father a job and gave the girl treatment in his own Henry Ford Hospital on the spot. While there are a lot of stories like this about Ford's generosity, it's hard to tell how many of them are true because Ford didn't like publicity that portrayed him as a philanthropist. With new employees, and with a company policy that nobody was to be laid off in reaction to the Depression, the Ford company found itself with a lot of labor. There's even stories about parts that there were too many of because the company wanted to keep everyone working even if the part the production line produced wasn't needed. So the spare parts were piled up all around the factory. Ford employees called them welfare units, when Ford wasn't around to hear, of course. Another way the labor was put to use was in the thousands of acres of farmland Ford had bought up in Michigan. Between 7,000 and 8,000 acres were dedicated to soybeans alone. The plan for this was to use a synthetic material produced from the plants and put it in cars. This was a very expensive process, costing the company both production and $5-day labor. Although the plan would successfully produce plastic for use in automobiles, the company would discontinue the operation after Ford's death. This type of thing was completely in character for Ford's so-called 20-track mind. Ford would describe the operation as adding industry to farming, making it much more efficient than any farming that had been done before. The next public drama that Henry Ford got himself into was the 1932 presidential election. In this election, Ford made no secret that he thought better of Hoover's economic policy than FDR's. Despite that, many people blamed then-President Hoover for the start and lack of stop to the Great Depression. FDR was elected, and in 1933, less than a year into his first term, Ford's first big clash with Roosevelt's federal government began. It started with the signing into law of the NRA, the National Recovery Act. The act included labor standards that seemed fair, like a reasonable minimum wage, among other things, but also gave the president the ability to further manipulate some of the standards in the future. As a sign of compliance with fair labor standards, companies were expected by convention to put the Blue Eagle stamp on the products they sold. Ford, as you might guess, took issue. The labor standards weren't a problem for him. The Ford company had been exceeding the standards set in the bill for years already. The problem lied in the principle of government overstepping their rights and regulation of business, as well as a small footnote in the bill mandating companies to allow workers to unionize. Because of this, Ford refused to put the Blue Eagle stamp on his cars, a decision which newspapers predictably swarmed around. Enter Hugh Johnson, one of FDR's advisors appointed head of the National Recovery Administration. Johnson's first response to Ford was constant badgering. He called him on the phone multiple times to talk about the Blue Eagle stamp, and eventually went to Dearborn to meet Ford in his office. This meeting is something spectacular. They talked not explicitly about the stamp, but about the broad abstract goals of the NRA, among which was labor stimulation through increasing minimum wage and decreasing maximum amount of hours worked by each individual, making it so companies would have to hire more people and add shift changes to their workers' schedules for the same amount of production. Ford agreed that the points mentioned would indeed contribute to bringing the economy out of the toilet. This pleased Johnson, and he left the meeting satisfied. Reportedly, after leaving Dearborn, he was surprised to find that Ford still refused the stamp because he didn't want government overstretching its powers in business. Johnson was getting miffed at this, not only because Ford, one of the biggest names in the country, was openly making a joke of this bill, now signed into law, that Johnson believed would be the magical cure to the economic mess they found themselves in, but also because Ford's competitors were getting antsy, worried that Ford would rub salt in the wound by raising his minimum wage to something unsustainable for the third time in 20 years, thus making them look bad by comparison. As it happens, Ford did just that, and also made a commitment to hire 5,000 veterans at his factories. Johnson, around the same time, attempted to organize a boycott campaign against Ford because he didn't carry the fair labor stamp, even though his workers had better conditions than blue stamp companies. The newspapers and everyone reading them were just eating up this whole fiasco. Johnson and Roosevelt's next move here was an executive order stating that, because Ford refused the stamp, his company would no longer be allowed to win government contracts even if Ford was the lowest bidder, which he often was. Despite the media utterly blowing this one out of proportion, this hardly hurt Ford's business at all because government contracts were a very small percentage of his total business. After a few years, in 1935, the government relented on this executive order, and Ford followed it up once again by raising his minimum wage to $6 a day. In spring of that year, the NRA Act was nullified in a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court, resulting from a poultry company suing against one of the many regulations. Not Ford this time. As for the state of the company in the early 30s, they were slipping. While still one of the huge names in the auto industry, they were no longer the unquestioned kings of it. Chevrolet's production and sales had caught up to them, and even passed them. By the end of 1932, although the company still had more than $500 million in reserve, they faced a $72 million deficit that year. When asked about the deficit in an interview, Henry Ford replied, "We didn't lose the money, we spent it." Ford stubbornly pressed on with a plan to produce 1 million cars in 1935, which he successfully did at the cost of over $650 million. Ford's battle against unions continued as well, even through some strikes in 1933. Ford had always seen unions as anti-production, and unions were now seeing the Ford plants as one of the last few, and certainly the biggest, stronghold of anti-unionism in the country. They tried relentlessly to get their influence inside his factories. In 1935, when the National Labor Relations Act passed, his response was, "The Ford Company has had a Labor Relations Act for years. I would be ashamed to have anyone tell me our conditions and pay are wrong. That part of my job was started 20 years ago. I have heard no complaints from our men. There is nothing a union can give them that they haven't already got. I haven't given the Wagner Act a thought. We've always had it in force." Ford was surprisingly healthy and fit in 1933, at the age of 70. He had operations for appendicitis and for a hernia, but recovered fast and was described to have had an agile body and a quick mind. His health at that age is credited to daily exercise, the exercise consisting of a walk or sprint through a nearby park. Ford also said of his diet that he eats only when he's hungry, rather than waiting for conventional mealtimes. He believed that when his belly was empty, he could think more clearly because the blood was in his head rather than in his stomach. By 1940, Ford was the last big auto manufacturer whose company was not unionized. Unions scored a victory in October of that year when the city of Dearborn gave them permission to stand outside the River Rouge plant at shift change time and distribute pamphlets to workers. This happened as a result of a circuit judge ruling that the ordinance against handbills was unconstitutional, something which was appealed by both the Ford Company and the city of Dearborn unsuccessfully. The unions wasted no time in getting people out there to hand union reading material to everyone at shift change. There was one instance in particular where the situation escalated and a group of union members got into a physical confrontation with some Ford Company guards after being ordered off a bridge whose use was restricted to Ford Company workers. As a result of some big news reporters getting injured in this scuffle, the small event got a large amount of press attention. Harry Bennett, still the director of labor relations at Ford's company, was a central figure in criticism against Ford. Following news of this, the National Labor Relations Board ordered the Ford Company to stop prohibiting union membership, stop using company guards to intimidate employees, and to rehire all previous employees who had been fired for union membership. Ford Company, of course, given confidence by their successful defiance of the NRA, defied this as well. After the Supreme Court in February 1941 refused to review the ruling of the NLRB, however, the Ford Company agreed to stop prohibiting union membership. Inside the plant, this made things more tense than they had ever been before. Inside the plant, one could instantly start seeing employees wearing union pins, something which would have been unthinkable a short time earlier. Representatives of the union would go to Ford management and ask them to address any one of the worker grievances that had built up over the past decades. They were dealt with as often as not. Workers and unions at this point were operating with the silent knowledge that Ford was probably in violation of a number of small, uncared about regulations. And with that leverage, they pushed for workers' rights inside the factory. Bennett fought back against this as efficiently as he could. He would find excuses to fire problem workers on the rare occasion that he could. He would move union representatives around to different work departments so that they could never get too familiar with those they represent in their own department. It was a continuous game of push and shove, with Ford ever so slowly losing ground. The situation escalated to departments of a few dozen people each having regular sit-down strikes to oppose the firing of their co-workers and other grievances. A quote from Ford about his attitude towards the union: "We will bargain with it because the law says so. We will bargain until hell freezes over, but they won't get anything." This continued until April of 1941. That was the start date of one of the biggest union strikes against Ford, and it happened in response to the unfair firing of 8 union representatives within the company. Not just any 8 either. These 8 were some of the highest-ranking union members in the Ford Company, and their termination meant a severe hindrance of the union's ability to organize within the plant. Bennett knew that this would result in a large-scale strike, but that was the point. He wanted to force the hand of the union and fight the fight on Ford's terms, not the union's. They knew that they would lose to the union if things continued in the way they were, so they wanted to give them an ultimatum. If they didn't strike after the 8 workers were fired, they would lose momentum and leverage. If they did, they would risk bad PR and government intervention in Ford's favor. That was the game they were playing. The unions, in response to this, put together a large organized sit-down strike in Ford's factories in April. In all, 85,000 workers in multiple factory buildings were prevented from entering their place of work by strikers, who had set up during the night shift a perimeter around the entire complex. Their demands were the rehire of the 8 that were fired, and the holding of an election that all Ford employees would vote in to determine whether or not union membership at the Ford Company would be mandatory, and if so, which union would look after all the employees. The first day of the strike went exactly how the unionists wanted it to go. Workers for the morning shift would attempt to get to the factory, and if they refused to abandon their job, they would be pulled from their cars and beat bloody. This lasted for 99 days with no interference from the government despite a plea from Bennett sent directly to President Roosevelt, and no ability on Ford's part to put together an effective strike-breaking action, despite the common belief that the company had a secret underground chamber filled with weapons, tear gas, and strike-breaking equipment controlled by an army of ex-convict pro-Ford thugs. The Ford Company's response to this was one they had been planning all along. They would ask the government for help. They would ask for police intervention, and they would ask the governor of the state and the federal government to mobilize National Guard to deal with the strikes. The thing they needed before this, though, was justification for intervention. They knew that the government wanted to keep domestic peace and prevent interference with the shipping of military equipment abroad, part of the Lend-Lease deal. If you want to know more about that, check out the video about it from this awesome channel. Because they wanted to hit on the halt to war production, the Ford Company spread the rumor that the strikers had not only stopped production, but were destroying equipment inside the factory, something that would cost time and money to repair. The truth was that production was stopped and nothing more. The strikers weren't even in the factory. The inside of the factory was controlled by a group of over 1,000 African Americans that Bennett had hired and brought up from out of state. Ford and Bennett would have the press believe that this group of African Americans were normal workers in the factory, loyal to Ford. Production narrative spun, they now needed evidence of chaos and violence among the strikers, something which, apart from stopping cars from entering the factory, the strikers weren't giving. They were as peaceful as could be expected because the union knew that if they were to win this strike, they needed to keep the moral high ground at all costs. Bennett tried to incite violence and rioting among the strikers a couple different ways, mainly by having the people inside the factory hurl bricks and other things down at the strikers from atop walls and rooftops. Some of the strikers hurled the bricks right back up at them, but apart from that, peace was kept. In fact, the strikers actually brought in the head of the NAACP at one point, who gave a speech through a loudspeaker which inspired a few hundred of the people in the factory to leave the area and abandon Bennett. Enough of them stayed, though. The strike was in this shape when Bennett wired a message to President FDR himself, asking for the government to intervene in the strike and describing a scene of chaos that the criminal terrorists were causing both inside the factory and out. The Ford Company made sure great publicity was made of this. The union, of course, knowing that the strike was more peaceful than not, and knowing their strikers did not have access to the inside of the building, publicly and loudly made their side of the story heard. The government did not intervene. With that lack of action, all the leverage was taken away from Ford, and since he didn't have the physical means to break the strike without causing a huge mess and multiple deaths, he was checkmated. Completely defeated, Ford was forced to offer extremely generous terms to striking workers and protesters in order to get his factory back. He agreed to allow them to have their election and to rehire 5 of the 8 original workers that were fired. The election took place shortly after, in late May, and was carefully watched by both parties. Tens of thousands of workers were compelled to vote, and the results were tallied up. To give an idea of the feeling of this, there was one anonymous worker who wrote in "Jesus Christ" on his ballot, and the pro-Ford counters successfully argued that by writing "Jesus Christ," the worker was referring to Henry Ford, and thus the vote should be counted as no union. The options given to the workers were CIO, AFL, or no union. Only 3% of the 83,000 voters chose no union, and 70% of the voters chose CIO. This meant that the CIO organization now officially represented all workers of the Ruth River plant. All employees there were members of the union, and the union membership fees were automatically taken from each of their paychecks. In return, the union now had a much stronger foothold from which they could have a go at the many built-up grievances. Employees previously fired for suspected union activities were now allowed to sue the Ford Company for wage disputes as well, and they were later allowed to be rehired at the Ford plant. This did not, however, stop him from suing the strike organizers for damages made to his shop and equipment. The union, in turn, forced Ford to increase worker wages, which had failed to increase along with the other companies in the industry and were no longer the best. The conflict between Bennett and the union, although greatly shifted in favor of the union, was not ended. Bennett would try, mostly unsuccessfully, to plant his own loyal employees into elections for department-level union leadership. He also granted special favors to low-level union leaders, trying to gain their favor. The Union was still very much in control, until Pearl Harbor and the start of World War II, during which all unions in defense manufacturing industries promised no strikes until the war is won, which Bennett took full advantage of, doing things that the Union would strike over in a heartbeat at any other time. The passive aggressions between the Union and the Ford Company would get so bad, in fact, that the Union requested an impartial judge to be appointed to help solve labor disputes. Ford agreed to have a judge, but then spent 5 months arguing with the union over who the judge would be. To the press, Ford was always careful to appear on good terms with the union, because his government contracts depended on it. Despite this, one union representative during the war years would remark that it was harder to arrange a meeting with Ford than with the President of the United States. 1938 was a big year in Henry Ford's personal life. It was the year of his 50th wedding anniversary and of his 75th birthday. For the former event, the man's love and passion for his wife had not diminished throughout the years. When asked years later about the greatest event in his life, he would reply, "Why, it was meeting and marrying Mrs. Ford. If anyone thinks I've done anything in my life, they should remember that my wife has been a great helper. I don't believe I would have got far without her. She's always believed in me and backed me in whatever I've attempted. I've always called her the Great Believer." For the latter event, his birthday, Ford was presented with honors from several different countries in recognition of his trailblazing in industrial production, and in auto mechanics. He was the first non-British native to earn a James Watt Medal from said land's government, a land where many of his factories were turning out cars. Russia also honored him. Ford had a long-standing friendship with Soviet industrialists, having sent engineers to Russia and received some of the Soviet engineers for training in production line techniques, as far back as 1929. The revolution in manufacturing in the Soviet Union after that greatly increased the Soviets' ability to hold the line against the Russians in the Eastern Front of the war. As a result of a funny twist of fate, some of these Soviet engineers happened to be at the Ford plant during the infamous Hunger March, and rumor has it they were laughing and joking about how silly the American quote-unquote communists were acting. He also earned an Iron Cross Award from Hitler's Weimar Germany, something which prompted many rabid, though not wholly misplaced, accusations of racism to be hurled. Ford did many dealings with the British. In fact, his Brit and Canadian factories were turning out war materials in the late 30s and early 40s, even as his American factories were participating in Lend-Lease. The most notable of these was his Windsor factory, which produced tanks throughout the war at peak production speed and efficiency. Ford also took great interest in farming during this time. In Britain, there's a story of him having dinner at an event attended by several lords. He got into a conversation with one of them and asked why the island was having such trouble producing food. The lord replied that they simply couldn't. The story goes that Ford replied, "Nonsense, let me show you." Within a year, Ford had bought a plot of land in England, and within another year, it had begun making a sizable profit selling vegetables. A quote from Ford, "There's not a country in the world that might not support itself if it knew how to use the soil." He believed that lack of knowledge of efficient farming methods, and the resulting scarcity of resources, is one of the things that fueled the early years of the Second World War in Europe. My opinion, he wasn't too far off. He also kept focus on the gradually improving process of making plastic from soybeans grown in South America. This came at a good time because the plastic was a nice replacement for many car parts made of metal, which had been rationed due to the war. In some cases, the plastic was found to be even better than the metal because, in case of an accident, the plastic was capable of bending and bouncing back like a rubber ball. He said of the plastics research facility, "I wouldn't be surprised if this library comes to be the most important building in our plant." He of course owned the farms in South America as well, because he didn't want to be caught not in control of any one level of production. Another Ford project at the time, another having to do with farming, consisted of adopting and reforming wards of the state. He bought a plot of land and built a sleeping quarters in 1938 that could house 62 older teenage boys. They were then allowed, with the help of advisors who knew what needed to be done and how, to delegate tasks amongst themselves and start an efficient farming business. The plan worked wonderfully. The boys turned a great profit, much of the money from which they were allowed to keep, and after their time farming, Ford offered to instantly hire each of them in his factory. Not a bad start to their adult lives. He said of them, "The boys are like most Americans. Give them a chance and they'll help themselves." The Ford Company had a knack for training young adults. In fact, shortly after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy contracted the Henry Ford Trade School to train their recruits in mechanical skills. The Ford Company obliged with plans to eagerly hire the surplus of skilled veterans after the war was over. Ford's attitude to the war at the beginning was much like that of the First World War, though less optimistic and more weary. He is said to have wished the two warring sides would destroy each other. When Pearl Harbor happened, again, much like the First World War, he turned his mind in favor of America throwing the last punch and not the first. By the end of it all, his feelings had slightly shifted to something which can be demonstrated by the quote, "It seems that wars are necessary to teach us lessons we seem unable to learn any other way." Following Pearl Harbor, Ford immediately took a huge contract of 4,200 airplanes for the U.S. government. The amount of planes for that contract later increased to 9,000. The Willow Run Factory was completed in 1942 and was over a mile long. It started producing planes immediately after construction. What the government had in mind was for the Ford Company to produce one bomber a day for the war effort. Ford had a different plan, to outdo expectations as usual and produce one bomber an hour. This goal, however, was not met until over 2 years later in 1944, because of various hang-ups at the Willow Run plant. For one, the company, used to making cars and not planes, began using expensive metal dies to cast their parts. The thing they weren't as prepared for was the frequent tweaks in the vehicle design, which meant they needed to get new dies every time the War Department came up with a new and improved plan for how to build the planes. For another, it was nothing short of a miracle that mass striking didn't occur at Willow Run. This is because of the lack of housing and the extreme inconvenience of transportation for workers. The lack of housing stemmed from an agreement between Ford and the city of Dearborn that they didn't want a flood of Democrat voters registering addresses in the reliably Republican district. While plans for new suburbs were considered, it never happened, and the employees would either have to carpool nearly an hour each way to and from Detroit every day, or set up camp in the now-growing trailer park sitting in a field near the factory. A lot of workers who got hired from out of state brought their families up, saw the park with its lack of running water or heat, and how inconvenient it would be for police or a fire company to attend it in case of emergency, and turned right back around to head home. Ford work wasn't worth it. About half the workers that did stay quit before their first month was complete. The low worker satisfaction, high turnover rate, passive-aggressive battle with the unions, and high frequency of workers just not showing up for work. Willow Run, dubbed Will It Run by Ford critics, had a messy and unproductive time. The messiness wasn't just on the worker level either. On the executive level, there was a circus of high turnover rates for Willow Run executives, both for medical reasons and for union reasons. One of the few that stayed working at Willow Run a significant amount of time was Ford's own son, Edsel. Edsel cared about Willow Run, and he worked hard to try and improve the production there. Unfortunately, in spring of 1943, he got sick, but he didn't take a vacation from working at Ford. In May of that year, perhaps due to being overworked while ill, he died due to intestinal failure. The trailer park would last throughout most of the year. In 1942, Ford sold a large area of land to the federal government for the purpose of emergency war housing. This housing would not be completed until later, and by the time the building was done, there were more homes than were needed, because Ford had overestimated the amount of employees needed to run the factory. Edsel's death was a significant blow to Ford's personal life, and to the company. Edsel and the company was seen as one of the few friends that the union had in the Ford higher-ups. Following his death, Henry, with a nod of silent consent, watched as Bennett purged the company of many of the officers that Edsel was protecting, most of whom were sympathetic to the union. Most people, both outsiders and company employees, saw this as a big step backward for the Ford company's social policy. Because of Henry's age, some speculated correctly that this would be Bennett's last big hurrah. Edsel's death left the Ford company without an heir. Henry, choosing his next of kin, had his grandson, Henry Ford II, pulled out of the Navy to serve the company's executive board, along with Edsel's widow. Not many people knew what to expect of Henry II. He was young, only in his early 20s, only recently married in 1940 to the daughter of a Cadillac executive, and hadn't developed a public reputation yet. He faced accusations of not showing any promise for the job, and not having any hope of living up to his grandfather's very large name. Nevertheless, he was put on the fast track to becoming the next president of the Ford Motor Company. After the final big leadership shuffle in Willow Run in late 1943, the plant leader they settled on was named Meade L. Bricker. Through 1943, Meade studied other plants, studied the Willow Run plant, and made adjustments to production methods until finally, in January of 1944, the goal of 1 bomber an hour was reached. This, despite a report the previous year that the military was using Ford planes only for training purposes because Willow Run wasn't turning out trustworthy, combat-ready vehicles. Despite that hang-up, the Ford company produced thousands of well-functioning tanks in Highland Park as well as factories abroad, in Britain and elsewhere. Credit goes to Union leadership for avoiding a single strike throughout the entire war. In a rare show of solidarity that rivals the Union's refusal to strike, is a visit to Willow Run from President Roosevelt, whom Ford had many public disagreements with in the past. Such a thing, accompanied by visits from the executives of other big car companies, went a long way towards raising morale. Henry Ford's company produced an immense amount of vehicles for the war effort. It got to the point where he started anticipating the military's need rather than waiting for a formal contract. Employees would note that he seemed to take on a new job every time he sat down to talk with an Army officer. All in all, it was estimated that he took over $2 billion worth of contracts for the war effort. This was the job that the entire preceding parts of his life had been preparing him for, and few people could have done this Herculean task better than Ford. When the war ended, the famous man who had lived an extraordinary life at last decided to retire and leave future generations to handle the company. Henry Ford II, 28 years old in 1945, began his long and successful career as CEO by finally putting a massive check on Bennett's influence within the company. It started with the demotion of Bennett himself, and the firing of over 1,000 employees, many of whom were allies to Bennett. But then Bennett's own removal quickly followed. The new Ford announced the company would enter a new era and would once again be the leader in the auto industry, with the highest wages, production, and quality in the market, all while being a friend to unions. A real friend, not like his grandfather and Bennett. He lost no time in taking steps to follow through with those promises, and he brought his brothers into the executive team at the company to help him do it. Optimism as well as productivity soared, and Ford even found himself negotiating his way out of a union strike and getting off easy because of his negotiation skills, while the GM factories suffered. Ford's competitors found a new reason to be very scared. Henry the Sr. sat back and didn't interfere. He was in his 80s now. He enjoyed his retirement for a short 2 years before, in April of 1947, he died of a brain hemorrhage. So passed from the world a man whose unrivaled power of thought paved the way for cars to be a vehicle for the masses.
Up to your waist in water, up to your eyes in sludge, using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. Oh, wouldn't join the army, that's what we all inquire. Don't we pity the poor civilian sitting around the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. It's a lovely war. Wouldn't be a soldier, eh?